Welcome, my name is Roland Guttenberg. I'm a PhD candidate at the Technische Universität München. The paper I will be presenting today is called Decision Power of Weak Asynchronous Models of Distributed Computing. This was a joint research together with Philip, Javier, and Martin. So in this paper, we consider a common framework for many models of distributed computing occurring in the literature. If you look through the literature, oftentimes you will find different definitions. Sometimes nodes have to hold with an answer. Sometimes they are allowed to change answer over the course of the computation, and different aspects where they differ. So we will now first introduce the common ground and the framework we will consider, and then introduce the differing aspects, and at the end get towards our decision power results for all the different models occurring from the different combinations of the aspects. So our framework, the input is a labeled graph, and every node of this labeled graph then executes an identical finite state machine. The nodes try to decide a property of the graph or initial labeling by consensus. I want to stress this, they want to try to decide a property of the graph or initial labeling. So in particular, they do not know whether they are ordered in a star or in a cycloid in some other advantageous fashion. In fact, that is what they try to figure out. So which properties could they, for example, try to decide? So they could try to decide whether there exists a blue node or whether the graph is a star. So how would they try to check whether how would the algorithm for checking whether there exists a blue node work? So if you are a blue node, then you will obviously start in the state yes. Otherwise, you would probably start in the state no. And the idea would be, if you have a neighbor in the state yes, that means your neighbor has heard of a blue node. So you know that there exists one and can safely change to the state yes. But these two guys, they do not have a neighbor in the state yes. All they see are guys in the state no, so they are nodes in the state no, so they will stay in the state no. Now, what happens if two neighbors are active at the same time? They both work with the current information, and they do not know that they are both active. So this node knows that he is in the state no, and his neighbor is in the state no, and will therefore move to the state no. On the other hand, this guy sees a neighbor in the state yes and will therefore move to the state yes. And now, as soon as everyone is selected, everyone will move to the state yes, because everyone has a neighbor in the state yes. And now we have reached consensus that there exists a blue node. But in order for this algorithm to work, nodes had to be allowed to change answer. So in a paper with the definition that nodes have to hold with a final answer, this algorithm would not have worked. Let's consider the other property. The graph is a star. So first, what is a star? A star is a tree where all but one node are leaves. The non-leaf node would then see the whole graph. Like this is, for example, a star, and this non-leaf node would now see the whole graph. So the node which should try to give the answer is the middle node, the non-leaf node. The other nodes should wait until they get the answer from this non-leaf node. And the important thing, of course, in the first step is everyone has to clearly state whether he's a leaf or not. So these two guys will state I'm a leaf. They will write =1 into their state. This guy will write greater than 1 into his state. He will state that he is not a leaf. This guy, we said, and we want him to wait until the middle guy answers. So this it does wait for now. And this one writes =1 into his state. So this guy will write =1. And this one, he has a lot of information, but not enough yet to decide that the graph is a star, so he will wait. But in this step, he now sees the whole graph because all his neighbors only have one neighbor, namely him. So he can safely answer yes, and the other nodes adapt the answer. So what was the aspect here? In this case, our nodes had to be able to count the neighbors. So in this case, in the left case, our nodes only had to check whether there exists some neighbor in the state yes. So they only had to check which states occur. In this case, they actually had to count how often the state occurs. So next, we consider a third aspect where models differ, and this is a more abstract aspect. I will try to introduce it using this question of, can we distinguish these two cycles? So how were the cycles chosen? Those cycles were chosen in such a way that if you walk along the cycle, then in both cases you see red, blue, black, and so on. And here too, red, blue, black, black. So is it possible to distinguish these cycles? So here we're introducing another common part of many models of distributed computing, that nodes are anonymous. You do not know the identities of your neighbors. So for example, this middle node in the state Q1, he can see that he has a neighbor in state Q0 and a neighbor in state Q2, but that is exactly the same that this node here sees. This node is also in the state Q1, has a neighbor in the state Q0 and a neighbor in the state Q2. Because they cannot distinguish the identities of these two, they will both perform, these two blue nodes will perform the same step. And also this one will perform the same step. On the other hand, these three red nodes, they are all in the state Q0, have a neighbor in the state Q1 and a neighbor in the state Q2. They will also all perform the same step. And now, okay, we could play this game for a long time, but as long as the scheduler always decides to select same color nodes at the same time, we cannot distinguish these two graphs. Because if this here is an accepting state, then this here is also an accepting state. If this here is a rejecting state, this here is also a rejecting state. So if this graph here is accepted, then this graph is also accepted. In this case, where the scheduler is allowed to decide that all the same color nodes are always selected at the same time. So altogether, there are four distinguishing aspects we considered, and the selection mechanism will be explained on this slide. So for detection, first we had non-counting. So the node main in this case only knows that there is a neighbor in state A and a neighbor in state B. It does not know that there are actually two. So it would perform the same step even if this node did not exist. On the other hand, in the counting case, main could perform different steps if this node does not exist or if this node does exist. Then for acceptance, we had either a node has to hold with a final answer or it can change answer arbitrarily along the computation. And now the different aspect, pretty intuitive. There are three selection mechanisms we consider and often considered in the literature. First, synchronous selection. Every node is selected in every step. Exclusive selection. Exactly one node is selected in every step. And liberal selection. Some subset of node is selected in every step. So now the fairness conditions. So the most simple fairness condition you can consider is every node is selected infinitely often. In this case, we cannot guarantee that the black nodes are not always selected at the same time. On the other hand, using the stronger condition, pseudostochastic scheduling, every finite sequence of selection occurs infinitely often, we can guarantee this. Because, in particular, forget about the finite sequence for now, but every selection occurs infinitely often. So if you take any node, then the selection, exactly this node, occurs infinitely often, even if we use the liberal scheduler and not the exclusive one. And so there was some prior research done into this already. So in particular, it was shown in the paper a classification of weak asynchronous models of distributed computing that the choice in the selection aspect does not influence the decision power. So our models are now given names according to the three remaining aspects, capital or small, depending on whether we chose the stronger or the weaker option in this aspect. So for example, small d, small a, and capital F would be the model where the nodes cannot count. Every node has to give a final answer, and we consider the strong fairness condition. So in altogether, we get this picture, where if we walk along the edges, then we know that the model is strictly stronger. Because here, for example, we're changing small t to capital D, here we're changing small a to capital A or small f to capital F, and so on. Why are there only 7 models in this picture? Because if you have non-counting and halting, then in no matter which fairness condition you have, you cannot decide anything. So there's one important restriction we make in our for our decision power results. We're only determining the decision power for labeling properties. The problem with for general properties is, imagine you allow properties like, if the graph is a star, decide whether there are more blue nodes than red nodes. If the graph is a cycle, then decide whether there are more green nodes than red nodes. Otherwise, decide whether all colors occurred the same number of times. If you allow complicated properties, then you will get some complicated characterization. And it will, at the end, be hard to determine whether the characterization might not be easier to understand in the model. We want a simple to understand characterization that people can be excited to look at. And for this, we took some reasonable restriction labeling properties. A lot of properties people are interested in, for example, for biological distributed algorithms, are labeling properties. The majority property, whether more nodes are blue than red, is a labeling property, for example. So how are labeling properties defined? So first we define the color count, which is the function assigning to every color the number of nodes of this color. And the property is then called the labeling property if it only depends on the color count. So an obvious non-example is the graph is a star, because this graph is accepted and this graph is rejected, but they both have the color count blue maps to 4. So that whether the property is true or not does not only depend on the color count. On the other hand, an obvious example is there exists a blue node, because we can express it as the color count of blue is at least 1. Now we're finally getting to our results. So there are 2 batches of results, one for the unrestricted set of graphs, so we only assume our graphs to be connected, and one for the bounded degree case, because for biological distributed algorithms, there's this important restriction that nodes know they have at most k neighbors. And in such a case, nodes will be a lot stronger, as we will see. So how do we structure this section? I will always mention one property, and then I will explain which nodes can compute this property and which ones cannot. So for example, for the there exists one blue node property, we have already seen an algorithm for these 4 models. Since they have capital A, that means they can change answer. That was the only restriction we had on slide 1. On the other hand, the small a models with halting acceptance, for those we have not seen an algorithm yet, and in fact there does not exist one. They cannot decide any non-trivial properties. In particular, not whether there exists a blue node. So now we're left with the rest of the graph. We're considering next the property there exist 2 blue nodes. So from this picture, you would probably imagine that counting is the important part, but actually not. The discerning part here is whether you have strong fairness or not. Because for the light blue model, we have actually already seen an argument why we cannot compute whether there exists exactly 2 blue nodes. And that is the fact that we cannot distinguish these 2 graphs. Because for weak fairness, we cannot guarantee that the blue nodes are not selected at the same time. But this graph has 2 blue nodes, and this graph has 1 blue node. So the fact that we cannot distinguish those means we cannot decide whether there are at least 2 blue nodes. In fact, they can only decide questions of the kind, there exists this color, there does not exist this color. The class cutoff of 1 is defined as all Boolean combinations of there exists a node of a certain color. So for example, the property there exists both 1 red and 1 blue node is included in this class. But there exists 2 blue nodes is not included. Now next we're considering a property we're actually interested in, the majority property. And sadly for this one we figured out that the purple model cannot compute it, cannot decide it. The purple model can only decide questions which are Boolean combinations of there exist this many nodes of a certain color. So for example, there exist 3 blue nodes and there exist 2 red nodes. but the majority property cannot be expressed as such a Boolean combination. Now, for the strongest model, we actually have hope. Where's the limit for the strongest model? Maybe we can even decide something like, is the number of blue nodes a prime number? And in fact, we can decide this question and many more. We can decide all of NL, i.e. non-deterministic logarithmic space. So of course, whenever we're mentioning space, then it's important to mention how our inputs are given. And N blue nodes is given as the first node is blue, the second node is blue, the third node is blue, and so on. So the input is given as a long list, i.e. in unary. In this case, the question of whether the number of blue nodes is a prime number is in NL. For example, the majority property is of course also in NL and many more. So with this model, we're quite happy. Okay, so what have we learned altogether? So it's important to have strong acceptance. If nodes cannot change answer, then for deciding labeling properties, we get trivial decision power. Then without strong fairness, we're also pretty weak and can only decide questions of the exist nodes of certain color. And in the unrestricted set of graphs, we really need all three aspects to have some strong decision power. So now again for the k-degree bounded graphs, we're starting with this time with the problem with the majority property immediately. Which models can compute the majority property? I won't spoil this result immediately, but I can definitely state that this one cannot compute it, and its decision power is again only cutoff of 1. But this one is now stronger. We'll see that later. Now that this graph is left, since all of them are pointing to the top, we're starting with the top model. What is the new limit for the strongest model? And in fact, it's now the theoretical maximum, non-deterministic linear space. Why is this the theoretical maximum? We have a linear number of nodes with a constant number of bits each. So we only have a linear number of bits available. Now for this model here, what do we know about this model? So we have considered these two graphs quite often already. What have we learned from them? If we accept this label count, then we also accept twice the label count. But the fact that we took exactly this label count is irrelevant. We could have also taken some longer cycle and copied that one. And we could have also copied it 3 times instead of 2. So what we learn is properties computed by this class have to be invariant under scalar multiplication. If you accept some label count, you also have to accept every multiple of it. If you reject some label count, you also have to reject every multiple of it. In particular, this would still include the majority property. Can we decide majority? The important next question. And in fact, yes, we can. And we can also decide all questions of the kind sum I, ai, xi is greater than or equal to, importantly, 0. Why 0? Well, we're not even able to decide whether there exist 2 blue nodes. So we obviously need this 0. And why is a majority property of this kind? Well, x minus y greater than or equal to 0 would be majority. Which other properties of this kind are there? Well, for example, whether at least 17% nodes of blue, but also some other rational fraction. So what are our results in the k-degree bounded case? Right, the part I haven't talked too much yet, the purple model in this case, is just as strong as the strongest model. So if you have strong acceptance and strong fairness, and you know that you only have at most k neighbors, then you don't need counting. And as before, we get some nice staircase. We're starting with trivial at the bottom, this time cut off only for this one model. Then we have this model where we sadly don't have a complete characterization yet. And the strongest model and also the purple one now has the theoretical maximum as decision power. Well, thank you for your attention. And on this slide, we again have our complete results in both cases, no unrestricted set of graphs and degree bounded graphs.